Carl Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't about mental illness. It was about people who see things others miss and why this ability can ruin them. In his clinical work, Jung documented patients with what he called special awareness. These people could notice tiny facial movements, sense hidden feelings, and perceived psychological patterns that everyone else missed. They saw through social masks, detected lies right away, and felt the unseen stress in every room. Jung called this finding dangerous because these people almost always ended up alone, exhausted, and unable to maintain normal friendships. This wasn't because they were unstable, but because seeing everything carried a psychological cost no one understood. Today, I'll talk about Jung's most dangerous discovery about people who see everything and why he believed this rare talent either destroys you or changes you into something amazing. The case that showed Jung this dangerous discovery began with a patient he described in his private papers, a very inward-focused, intuitive person who came to him in 1913 during Jung's own personal crisis after he separated from Freud. This patient, representing what Jung would later call the rarest personality type, had what he termed unfiltered intuitive sight. She could walk into any room and instantly feel the psychological vibe. Who was lying? Who was in emotional pain? Who held secret anger? Jung wrote, "The patient shows an extraordinary power for sensing hidden thoughts in others, but this skill seems to cause her great distress instead of benefit. She couldn't engage in small talk because she saw through every social pretense. She couldn't keep friends because people felt exposed and awkward around her. She couldn't hold a job because her presence messed up the unspoken rules that keep groups working." Jung realized he wasn't treating a disease. He was observing what happens when the hidden mind becomes too visible, when perception becomes too sharp for social survival. He wrote down her descriptions of people with shocking accuracy. She speaks of others as if she can access their private thoughts and hidden motives. When I check her observations carefully, they prove remarkably correct. This wasn't mental illness or false beliefs. This was consciousness so developed it had become socially risky. But Jung found something even more troubling. This patient's extraordinary sight seemed impossible to explain. So, Jung started looking into what he would later call mystical sharing, the psychological event where people with very keen intuition become overloaded by the hidden thoughts and feelings from others. Jung wrote in his Red Book, notes, "There are those among us whose mental system is so sensitive that they take in not just clear messages, but the entire hidden atmosphere of their surroundings." Modern research by Dr. Elaine Aron on highly sensitive people supports Jung's early findings. Her research shows that about 20% of people have increased sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Jung pointed to something more specific in his psychological categories, the introverted, intuitive type, making up roughly 1% of the population, who don't just feel things deeply, but notice hidden patterns with surprising clarity. Jung observed that these people have what he called specialized intuitive function. Their brains process not just obvious social signs, but unconscious emotional states, repressed material, and psychological patterns that others can't notice. They see the sadness behind fake smiles. They sense the desperation beneath confident talk. They feel the group's hidden faults that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. Jung wrote, "The danger isn't in the perception itself, but in the mental isolation it creates. When one sees clearly what others cannot or will not see, one becomes a mirror that society cannot stand to look into." This creates what Jung called the problem of the strongest skill, when your greatest strength becomes your greatest burden because it separates you from the group's unconscious agreements. But Jung discovered the true danger wasn't the perception itself. Because people with highly sharp perception clearly see others' hidden faults, they become targets for what Jung thoroughly documented as shadow projection, where people unconsciously attack them for showing what they refuse to admit about themselves. Jung wrote in Psychology of the Unconscious, "Nothing has a stronger psychological influence on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent." But he discovered this idea extended to all connections. When someone's hidden self is shown back through another person's clear sight, the unconscious mind has two options: accept the hidden self or attack the mirror. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. The person who sees clearly gets blamed for creating the problems they're only observing. His patients with this special intuition experienced this constantly. When they would gently suggest that someone seemed troubled, that person would explode at them for being negative or causing drama. When they'd express concern about clear problems, they'd be accused of being judgmental or making up issues where none existed. Jung realized this wasn't a coincidence. It was a psychological defense. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote, "Everything that bothers us about others can lead us to understand ourselves." But for most people, it's easier to attack the person reflecting their hidden self than to look at what's being reflected. This creates what Jung called the scapegoat effect. Highly perceptive people often become the designated problem in every group they join. Not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems that already exist in the group's hidden mind. Jung observed, "The bearer of superior awareness becomes the container for all that the group cannot consciously admit about itself." This pattern explains why these individuals don't just feel misunderstood. They feel systematically targeted by a force they can't logically explain. But Jung's most disturbing discovery was still to come. Jung noticed that overwhelming perception showed up differently in different individuals. So he found 4 distinct patterns within the introverted intuitive type, each representing a different way of handling hidden thoughts and feelings from others. Type 1. The feeling intuitive. Jung documented patients who combined introverted intuition with a specialized feeling skill. These people don't just see what's happening psychologically, they feel it in their own bodies. They absorb others' emotions so completely, they often can't tell the difference between their own feelings and those they've unconsciously taken in. Jung wrote, "The feeling intuitive lives in a state of constant emotional infection, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone around them." Type 2. The thinking intuitive. These people see psychological patterns and predict what people will do with surprising accuracy. Jung observed they could foresee relationship failures, job disasters, and personal breakdowns months before they happened, not through logic, but through unconscious pattern recognition. Jung noted, "They have an unusual ability to perceive the logical outcomes of hidden processes that others cannot yet see." Type 3. The sensation intuitive. Jung documented patients who could sense the physical signs of psychological states in others, detecting sickness before symptoms appeared, sensing tiredness before it was admitted, or feeling the bodily tension that indicated emotional distress. Jung wrote, "These people act as early warning systems for mental and physical sickness in their environment." Type 4. The pure intuitive. The rarest type Jung met combined introverted intuition with what he called unspecialized supporting skill. They saw everything but had trouble organizing or expressing their perceptions clearly. Jung observed, they live in a state of constant overload, receiving vast amounts of hidden information without enough mental structure to process it usefully. Understanding your specific pattern is crucial because each type needs different ways to approach what Jung called the integration challenge. But first, you need to understand why Jung thought this discovery was so dangerous. Jung observed the terrible effects of unspecialized perception on his patients. He concluded that seeing everything without proper psychological integration posed real dangers to both the person and the well-being of the group. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that made this discovery so threatening. Danger 1: collective unconscious disruption. Jung wrote, "The individual who perceives too clearly threatens the shared agreements upon which social unity depends." When someone sees through the shared fantasies that hold groups together, the unspoken agreements to ignore certain truths, they become a destabilizing force. Jung observed that organizations, families, and societies work partly through collective unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. The highly perceptive person accidentally breaks these agreements simply by being truly themselves. Danger 2: psychological isolation. Jung documented how specialized perception creates what he called the problem of the strongest skill. When your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering, he wrote, the curse of awareness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unawareness. This isolation isn't just social, it's deeply personal. These people often say they feel like they're living in a different reality from everyone else. Danger 3: identity dissolution. Most dangerously, Jung found that people who absorb hidden contents from others often lose touch with their own true personality. They become so swamped with external psychological material that they can't tell the difference between their own inner world and what they're absorbing from their surroundings. Jung called this mystical sharing, a state where mental boundaries disappear and the individual becomes mixed with group unconscious contents. He wrote, "The danger is not merely social exile, but psychological destruction, the complete loss of individual identity in favor of group control." This is why Jung thought the integration of superior perception was not just helpful for therapy, but mentally urgent. Because unintegrated superior perception posed such dangers, Jung developed what he called the individuation process, a systematic way to keep individual identity while developing a conscious relationship with hidden contents. Phase 1: recognition and differentiation. Jung taught his highly perceptive patients to first recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that wasn't theirs. He called this conscious distinguishing, the ability to tell the difference between a real inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. Jung wrote, "The first job is to figure out what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this separation, there can be no individual growth." Technique. Jung told patients to spend time completely alone daily, allowing absorbed material to settle so they could recognize their own authentic psychological voice. Phase 2: shadow integration. Jung discovered that people who see others' hidden faults clearly often do so because they haven't faced their own. The more you deny your own ability for lying, selfishness, or cruelty, the more disturbed you'll be by seeing these qualities in others. Jung wrote, "Everything that bothers us about others can lead us to understand ourselves, but only if we have the courage to look inward rather than staying focused outward." Shadow integration means admitting that you contain every human quality you observe in others. This doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a whole person who can see clearly without judging. Phase 3: conscious participation. The final phase involves what Jung called conscious joining in the collective unconscious, the ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed or losing your individual identity. Jung wrote, "The individuated person can serve as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, helping to make the unconscious conscious in others without losing their own psychological soundness." This requires developing what Jung called psychological containers, the ability to hold others' unconscious contents temporarily while remaining aware that they are not your own. Because Jung understood that superior perception either destroys or improves individuals, he studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and psychological breakdown. The case of Nietzsche. Unintegrated perception. Jung was deeply influenced by Nietzsche's philosophy but observed how his superior perception ultimately led to mental collapse. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung wrote about Nietzsche's ability to see through social, religious, and philosophical fake fronts with devastating clarity. However, Jung noted that Nietzsche never learned to use these insights constructively. Instead of using his perception for healing, he used it as a weapon against society. Jung wrote, Nietzsche had amazing insight into human nature, but he remained identified with his strongest skill rather than integrating it into a balanced personality. Jung observed that Nietzsche's isolation and eventual breakdown showed what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by what they see rather than transformed by it. The case of Meister Eckhart. Successful integration. Jung extensively studied the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart, whom he considered an example of successfully integrated superior perception. Eckhart possessed what Jung called mystical intuition, the ability to perceive spiritual and psychological realities that others could not access. But unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart channeled his insights into compassionate service. Jung wrote, Eckhart transformed his superior perception into wisdom that could help others without overwhelming them. He saw clearly, but spoke in ways that encouraged understanding rather than resistance. Jung noted that Eckhart's success came from what he called conscious modesty, the recognition that superior perception is a gift to be shared wisely, not a weapon to be used. Jung's own integration journey. Most importantly, Jung documented his own struggle with overwhelming perception during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious from 1913 to 1919, recorded in the Red Book. Jung wrote, I was threatened by a psychosis and was saved only by my ability to understand what was happening to me through my work with patients. His superior perception of unconscious contents, both his own and others, nearly ruined him until he learned to integrate these experiences consciously. Jung's major realization came when he understood that his overwhelming perceptions weren't symptoms of disease, but were evolutionary. They represented consciousness trying to develop beyond current group limitations. This realization changed how he approached patients with similar gifts. Because individuals with superior perception often face isolation, Jung emphasized the crucial importance of finding what he called the few who understand, others capable of engaging with special awareness without defensiveness. Jung wrote in The Development of Personality, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But this privilege cannot be realized alone. It requires being seen by those capable of recognizing authenticity. Jung identified 3 essential types of relationships for the highly perceptive person. Type 1. Fellow individuated persons. Jung wrote, the individuated person recognizes another individuated person immediately. There is a quality of presence, a genuineness that cannot be faked. These connections often happen instantly and intensely. You recognize each other as members of what Jung called the conscious minority. These relationships are rare but essential for psychological survival. With fellow individuated persons, you can be completely authentic without fear of overwhelming or threatening them. Type 2. Those engaged in individuation. Jung observed that people actively working on their own individuation process, therapy, inner work, spiritual practice, can often handle superior perception without defensiveness. They may not possess it themselves, but they understand its value. Jung wrote, Those who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others. Type 3. Natural containers. Jung identified individuals who, while not having superior perception themselves, have what he called natural containing function, the ability to hold psychological content without being overwhelmed by it. These might be mature people who have dealt with significant life difficulties. The recognition process. Jung developed specific signs for identifying safe relationships. They ask genuine questions about your observations rather than immediately defending against them. They can admit their own contradictions and limitations without shame. They show what Jung called psychological maturity.